The war had dragged on for years, and the autumn of 1944 carried a strange quiet across the French countryside. The guns still thundered far away, but here, in the ruins of a captured German field post, silence had taken command. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons above broken trees, the smell of burnt fuel mixing with damp earth. British trucks rumbled slowly down a muddy road, carrying both the wounded and a small group of captured German medical officers. Their gray uniforms were stained and wrinkled, their faces lined with exhaustion rather than fear. They'd been told nothing, only that they were being taken to a nearby field hospital. Inside the tented compound, the sound of a radio hummed faintly through static. BBC reports about battles hundreds of miles away. The British surgeons worked under dim lamps, their voices low, their hands steady, despite the fatigue that came from days without rest. The air was heavy with morphine, smoke, and quiet determination. When the German doctors were brought in, the guards expected resistance, perhaps arrogance, perhaps defiance. But the men stood still, uncertain, waiting for orders from the same kind of officers who until days ago had been their enemies. A British captain approached, tall, expression unreadable. His uniform was soaked at the shoulders, his eyes red from sleepless nights. He looked at the captured doctors, then at the rows of wounded soldiers lying on stretchers, some British, some German, some too pale to tell the difference anymore. For a moment, no one spoke. The captain's voice finally broke the silence, calm but heavy with intent. "You are doctors. They are men in pain. I expect you to do what doctors are meant to do." The words hung in the air like cold fog. The Germans looked at each other, unsure whether it was a cruel trick or a test. One, an older field surgeon with gray hair under his cap, stepped forward slowly. He had served since Poland, through the deserts, through the ruins of cities. His hands had patched hundreds, maybe thousands of men. But never this, never those he had been told were enemies. He adjusted his spectacles and asked, almost whispering, "You want us to treat them?" The captain gave no answer beyond a nod. Minutes later, the sound of gloves snapping and metal trays clinking filled the tent. British nurses guided the Germans toward the wounded, showing them supplies and instruments. The moment was surreal. Men who once served opposite flags now bending over the same stretchers, the same cries for help echoing around them. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and the faint murmur of artillery from distant hills. Inside, the war seemed to pause. For the first time in years, these men were not enemies. They were simply human beings fighting for breath, for mercy, for life itself. The lamps flickered as the night deepened. Rain whispered against the canvas roof, steady and cold. Inside the field hospital, the air was thick with tension and disbelief. The captured German doctors moved carefully between the cots, their steps slow, as if each movement might awaken an invisible line that should never be crossed. The British medics watched closely, unsure whether to trust them or fear them. The war had trained everyone to suspect kindness, to question mercy. Yet here they were, men trained to destroy, now asked to heal side by side. A British nurse named Ellen guided one of the German surgeons toward a badly wounded corporal. The man's chest rose unevenly, blood seeping through the bandages. The German hesitated, his hand trembling, before he reached for the instruments. Ellen noticed his hesitation and quietly said, "If you can help him, do it. That is all that matters tonight." Her voice was calm, the kind that carried through chaos without force. He looked at her, nodded once, and began his work. The sound of his scalpel cutting through the bandage seemed to echo across the tent, louder than the storm outside. At another table, a young British doctor passed surgical tools to a German medic who could barely keep his hands from shaking. The German muttered something in his own language, perhaps a prayer, perhaps regret. The British doctor did not understand, but he sensed the meaning in the man's tone. Around them, nurses whispered instructions, the rhythmic clicking of instruments punctuating the silence. It was no longer a war zone. It was a place where humanity was struggling to breathe again. In one corner, Captain Hughes stood watching the scene unfold. He had seen countless operations, too many deaths to remember. But this was different. There was no triumph here, no victory, only a strange peace born from exhaustion and moral confusion. These Germans had been enemies, yet now their faces showed the same sorrow that lived in his own heart. He had lost friends in air raids, brothers in burning tanks, but at this moment revenge seemed too small, too hollow. The captain turned toward the radio, its static murmuring through the tent. A reporter's voice spoke faintly about advances at Arnhem, about courage and losses. The words faded under the sound of rain. Hours passed. The doctors worked until their eyes burned and their fingers stiffened. Bandages ran out, morphine thinned, but the wounded still came in from the dark. At some point, the German surgeon looked up and saw Ellen again, wiping her forehead with a cloth. He said softly, "Tonight, we are not enemies." She did not answer at first, only met his eyes, then whispered, "Maybe that is how peace begins." For a brief moment, neither of them felt the war pressing against their shoulders. The storm outside raged, but inside, something fragile and unseen had begun to heal. By dawn, the storm had passed. The fog crept back across the valley, curling low over the tents like a ghost refusing to leave. The smell of rain mixed with disinfectant, sweat, and coffee gone cold. Inside the hospital, the light was soft and gray, filtering through torn flaps of canvas. Some soldiers slept, others moaned quietly in their dreams. The German doctors sat slumped against the walls, too tired to speak, their gloves stained and their minds wandering between guilt and relief. For a few silent hours, there had been no war, only the rhythm of breathing, the faint pulse of men saved from death. Captain Hughes stepped through the rows, checking each cot with slow, deliberate care. He paused beside the older German surgeon, who was resting his eyes. The man stirred as Hughes approached. Their gazes met, neither hostile nor friendly, only honest. "You did good work," Hughes said. The German doctor nodded faintly, unsure if it was a compliment or a confession. "Doctors do what they must," he replied in slow English. Hughes studied him for a long moment before answering, "So do soldiers." Then he walked away, leaving the words to hang in the mist like unspent gunfire. Outside, the early light revealed a landscape of quiet ruin. The field beyond the tents was littered with abandoned helmets, broken stretchers, and tire tracks pressed deep into the mud. The sound of engines started somewhere in the distance, British convoys preparing to move east again. The war machine was waking up. Orders would soon come down from headquarters. The front never waited for reflection. Yet inside the tent, time still moved differently. The nurses cleared away used instruments, cleaned the floors, folded blankets. The German prisoners helped without being told. No one mentioned it, but everyone noticed. Ellen stood by the entrance, sipping weak tea from a tin cup. The German surgeon approached her, his posture weary but dignified. "How many survived?" he asked. She looked toward the cots. "More than we expected." He nodded, his eyes tracing the wounded faces. "I treated men from Stalingrad to Normandy," he said quietly. "But last night was the first time it felt like medicine again." Ellen watched him struggle with the words, the conflict inside him plain as the dawn outside. "War changes everyone," she said, "but maybe not forever." A British corporal entered the tent, calling for the captain. Orders had arrived. The German medical staff were to be transferred to a POW camp by noon. The announcement stirred a murmur through the room. The Germans froze, understanding that this strange alliance, this brief ceasefire of compassion, was ending. They removed their gloves, washed their hands in silence, and looked once more at the men they had saved. One of the wounded reached out, weakly gripping the surgeon's arm. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The German looked down, eyes glistening with fatigue, and replied softly, "You would have done the same." The morning light slowly brightened over the horizon, painting the soaked fields in shades of pale gold and gray. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still soft beneath the soldiers' boots. The air carried a strange quiet that came only after battle, when both victory and loss felt the same. Trucks lined up near the hospital, engines rumbling low as British guards prepared the German prisoners for transfer. The doctors packed their small medical kits, though they knew they would not be using them again soon. Some kept small instruments tucked in their pockets, not as weapons, but as reminders of the night that had changed something deep within them. Captain Hughes stood near the road, reading the orders twice, though he already knew what they said. The German medical unit was to be moved to a secured POW facility outside Amiens. Their temporary duty under British command was officially concluded. He looked up at the tent, now quiet, except for the slow steps of nurses finishing their morning duties. The wounded slept under fresh bandages, their faces calm in the soft light. The silence inside felt heavier than gunfire. When the German surgeons emerged, helmets in hand, Hughes motioned for them to gather near the trucks. No words were exchanged at first. It was the kind of silence born of respect, not surrender. Ellen stood behind Hughes, holding a clipboard against her chest. She watched as the older German doctor, the one who had worked beside her through the longest hours of the storm, approached the captain. He saluted, not as an enemy, but as a man acknowledging another who had done what he believed right. Hughes returned the gesture without hesitation. The older man then turned to Ellen. His voice was soft, steady. "You showed me something last night I thought the war had buried," he said. "Compassion still breathes." She tried to smile, but her eyes stung. "It always does," she answered. "It just hides under the noise." The engines grew louder. The German doctors climbed onto the back of the truck, their boots clanking on metal steps. Hughes stepped closer to the vehicle. "If the world remembers anything," he said, "let it remember that men can still choose mercy." The older doctor nodded once, eyes glimmering in the pale sun. As the truck rolled away, its tires cutting through the mud, the wind carried the faint sound of the radio again, news of advancing lines, new offensives, new suffering. Yet, for a brief heartbeat of history, there had been something different, something fragile and human among the endless destruction. Ellen turned back toward the hospital tent. The lamps were off now, the beds neatly lined, the smell of ether fading into morning air. She paused at the entrance, glancing at the distant convoy disappearing into fog. The war would continue. Orders would keep coming. The world would not pause for small mercies. But she knew that what had happened inside that tent would never leave her. Somewhere between the wounded and the enemy, between pain and duty, she had witnessed the rarest victory of all, the victory of humanity itself.